Bienvenue, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Kyla Sweet, Education and Curriculum Specialist for Study Canada K-12. And on behalf of the Center for Canadian American Studies and the Western Washington University Alumni Association, welcome to our, believe it or not, final webinar in the Diversify Your French series, which has aimed to help you add more global and diverse perspectives to your French classroom. So funding for this series was partially provided by a U.S. Department of Education Title VI grant supporting the Pacific Northwest National Resource Center on Canada, which is a consortium of the University of Washington and Western Washington University. And a special welcome today to our cohort of French teachers who have attended all 4 sessions in the series and provided their thoughts and reflections on the topics. Your input has been really vital, so thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge that we gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And today I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Yulia Bosworth and her session, Quebec French and Culture. Dr. Yulia Bosworth is an associate professor of French and linguistics in the Department of Romance Languages at Binghamton University, and she specializes in sociolinguistics of North American French, and with a focus, on language ideologies and the relationship between language and identity in Quebec. Dr. Bosworth is the current Vice President of the American Council for Quebec Studies and the Faculty Director of Understanding Modern Quebec, a summer program on French languages and Quebec culture in Quebec City, Quebec for U.S. undergraduate students, which I believe she has just returned from this year. And I am so happy she could join us today. So thank you so much and welcome, Dr. Bosworth.
Great, thank you. I will now begin sharing my presentation, Language and Culture in Quebec, Quebecois French in Your Curriculum. I wanted to start a little bit by telling you a bit about where I'm coming from in all this. So a little bit of the context from my perspective. I teach courses in French as well as linguistics in the Department of Romance Languages at Binghamton University. And we're fortunate to be able to support a fairly robust French major and minor program in which we have 2 tracks, one in French and Francophone studies and one in French language and linguistics, which is where I do most of my work. And kind of the angle that I'll be taking in this presentation as far as how to integrate Quebecois French content in your classroom curriculum will be in that area, French language and linguistics. So we just mentioned that my research focus is sociolinguistics of North American French. I'm a sociolinguist. So again, that plays an important role in how I'm approaching this. And how I approach incorporating Quebec French in my classroom in general. I look at language attitudes and ideologies, language and identity, and I often focus on the political sphere in discourse. I teach a number of courses with a prominent Quebecois component. I teach a course called Understanding Modern Quebec, which we just mentioned in my introduction. And that's a course that I teach partly on site and partly online. So it's a hybrid course that allows students a certain degree of flexibility in terms of how much time they spend at home before they come to Quebec and learn on site together, immersed in the target culture and the language. I also teach a course at the 400 level or 4,000 level, depending on your institution, that is called French in North America. And Quebec being the bastion of French in North America, we devote the majority of our time in the course to Quebec. I also try and incorporate Quebecois content in most of my courses. Phonetics and pronunciation, introduction to French linguistics, structures and sounds of spoken French. Wherever I can, I'm able to include modules or certain ways in which students can concentrate on Quebec content in their assignments and projects and research papers in upper level courses. So the summary of my talk, I'm going to start by trying to kind of articulate what is Quebec French? What is Québécois French? Français Québécois. We all have this understanding, of course, being French instructors of what it is. It's a type of French, it's a version of French, it's a dialect, it's a variety of French. But sometimes it's really hard to articulate it in the way that really captures the status of this variety of French within the larger francophonie. And sometimes if we're not really able to articulate it to students, we're not able to communicate its legitimacy and its value, social value, linguistic value, cultural value to our students. So I wanted to give my audience today some tools about how to really talk to our students about Quebec French. The resources for integrating Quebecois French into our courses will follow. And then I'm going to focus on a specific aspect of one of the particularities of Quebecois French, which is inclusive language use. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the idea that Quebec has been at the forefront of the movement of initially feminization, and today we're looking at more inclusive use of language that incorporates communities beyond just reflecting the male and the female, but also going to non-binary speakers and including them in our representations, linguistic representations of professions and designations, etc. I will then briefly give you examples of courses that I'm able to teach. I just referred to them a little bit, but maybe in greater detail toward the end. And I will also provide a list of some additional resources that you can use if you're looking to incorporate Quebec content into your courses. And again, the focus here is really on Québécois French. So what is it and how do we talk about it to students? So I wanted to share with you kind of a summary of the model of language variation that I use in my courses when I try and help students situate Quebec French on the continuum or in the space of all varieties of French spoken in the francophonie. So, we're looking at 4 different types of variation: the diachronic variation, variation diachronique, historical changes, historical variation from one period to another. And it's not particularly relevant here, even though oftentimes, there's this notion out there that, Quebec French is an older version of French spoken by, the French royal court in the 16th, 17th century. And whereas, this is that particular aspect does play a role on what Québécois French is. It's really just not an accurate way to describe Quebec French. It's not some sort of version of historical French frozen in time. So what is really relevant here is variation diatopique, so geographic variation. And what we talk about here are 2 types of varieties, variété, right? So instead of using the term dialect, and I will explain a little bit later why it's preferable to go with variety, variété, which is what is used in sociolinguistics today. So the national variety, which would be something like France, but also a Français Québécois is considered a variété nationale. And then you're looking at regional varieties, something like, le Français du Sud, Français méridional, Southern French, Acadie, Louisiane. The social variation plays an important role. So the way that language is used differently by speakers as a function of their social milieu, their education level, so scolarité, âge, and sex. And variation diaphasique, so situational variation. And the notions that are critical here are the formal variety. Sometimes the term registre or register or niveau de langue is used. But again, we're going to try and stick to more neutral terms that do not necessarily have a hierarchical interpretation or interpretation that assigns a value judgment to a way of speaking a language. So in French, it's typical to talk about these distinctions as une variété soutenue, une variété familière. And so now I'm showing how this plays out in the francophonie itself, because that model, it doesn't just apply to French, it applies to the way that all languages function. What I'm showing here, I'm trying to capture in this diagram, is the idea that different communities of speakers in the francophonie, these different regional national varieties, most frequently national varieties, have their own local standards. And up at the top, those local standards resemble one another. It's only as you start moving kind of unfortunately, the term down the kind of the continuum, even though we don't want to attribute this sort of up and down kind of value judgment, but nonetheless, it allows us to kind of graphically represent this. Now, as you move away from the local standards, now the features that distinguish these languages, these varieties from one another, become more pronounced. So the variété familière of French spoken in France versus Belgium versus Morocco versus Quebec versus Senegal, et cetera, that's where you will find greater variation. But again, the variété soutenue, which is the language, the way of speaking and writing, using language that's most closely associated with l'écrit, right? So written, French written language, that's where you find the most resemblance. And today, we refer to that kind of abstract notion of French as a whole as le français de référence, reference French. And in a little bit, I will explain why that term is preferable to what have come before, and of course is still circulating in our community of speakers and instructors and learners. So in the francophonie of North America, francophonie nord-américaine, you basically have three main varieties, like three axes. You have le français québécois, and that's what we're focusing here on today, and le français acadien, le français louisianais. So those are the three most discernible varieties that of French spoken in North America. And le français québécois is the variety spoken by the greatest number of speakers, and for obvious reasons has quite a bit of weight sociopolitically within the francophonie nord-américaine. And just to quickly broach the issue of language, dialect, or something else, there are different ways to refer to different, I guess it's varieties of the French language spoken out there. And dialect is a term that still, is still prevalent and pervasive. And there's nothing wrong with it in and of itself, but it does kind of mask the notion that a lot of these distinctions are quite arbitrary, and they're really conditioned by social factors, socio-historic, socio-political factors, rather than any linguistic reality. So I'm using here this really popular quote that I often discuss with my students in my courses in French linguistics, is a really great way to start a discussion. What is the difference between a language and a dialect? And there is this a statement that is often attributed to a Yiddish linguist, Max Weinreich, who said, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And I often ask students to analyze that statement and kind of try and sort of unpack it and tell me what they think that means. And they almost always arrive at this idea that really the distinction between a dialect and a language, the series of distinctions, they're really quite arbitrary. And linguistically, a dialect, has grammar, has, lexicon and morphosyntax, and so does a language. So what we kind of adopted in sociolinguistics is this notion of a variety, une variété de français, a variety of French, to refer to français québécois, or français acadien, français louisianais, français, the French spoken in France as well. And we'll see in a second what that's typically known as today. It's really important here to introduce the notion of the ideology of the standard. And if you haven't really heard this particular concept used before, it's really just exactly what it sounds. It's just this way of thinking that, and I have this definition that is very widely used out there by Rosina Lippi-Green in her kind of foundational text, English with an Accent. It's kind of this bias toward an abstract, idealized, homogeneous language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions, and which has as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class. So in the francophonie, this ideology of the standard, it really is quite pronounced. Many believe that it's much more pervasive and has stronger influence than this kind of way of looking at language in other societies. And I'm sure that you've encountered different manifestations of this ideology of the standard being connected to French in various ways. But what research has found in this area is that it not only dominates the French-speaking world and the speakers, but by extension, it dominates our classrooms, our materials, our approaches, methodology, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you take this definition and recast it in the context of the French-speaking world, you're definitely talking about, who sets these parameters of the standard, the upper middle class. We're talking about the educated Parisian, cultural elites, and which is why in the past, and I think for many, that's still sort of very valid, this idealized notion of what is the correct French to teach and to speak, it would be something like français parisien, which is very much aligned with that notion of the ideology of the standard, one variety that is legitimate for all speakers. Terms like français international and métropolitain have been used in the past, and for many, international is kind of an improvement on parisien. But some would say it's really a term that doesn't capture really much of anything. What exactly is français international? So français standard is a term that is used quite a bit, and just the term standard, of course, encapsulates quite a bit of that value judgment and the legitimacy of just the one variety. So today, as I've briefly mentioned before, and I'm sure this isn't the last instantiation, it's just where we are in our evolution of, naming, calling things in order to reflect kind of our latest set of values and perspectives. And that's français de référence, a reference French. So really quite neutral in the sense that it's just, what we use as our reference, regardless of which community of speakers in the francophonie we're working with. And yes, Français de référence is most closely associated with the actual French spoken by an actual community of speakers of France, which is also very diverse, but that kind of national variety is known today as Français hexagonal. So hexagonal French. It doesn't have the most elegant sound in English, I don't think, but it's has definitely caught on and is circulating in at least the scholarly circles in French. And I'm just giving here a couple of abbreviations so we don't have to, so I don't always have to write out, Français de référence is FR, Français hexagonal is FH, and again, the latter is associated with French spoken in France, which is not monolithic. Now, it's much more natural for us as educators with a lot of experience dealing with different communities of speakers, whether it's through reading or contact or field work or personal relationships that we have. But for students, a lot of this is really not the most obvious set of concepts and notions. So what I do in my class is to prime students to start looking at different varieties of French and Français Québécois. So before we start delving into Français Québécois, I like to get them warmed up and to help them develop some sort of accent awareness and sensitivity, because even though Québécois French is not the distinctiveness of Québécois French as of any other variety is not just reduced to accent, but it is often kind of that distinctive feature of Quebec French that many students and instructors encounter in their travels and their experiences with French. So that's something that they find striking. And students often report not being able to understand Quebec French when they travel, etc., just because to them, because of the way that it sounds and the accent is just quite different from the French that they learn in the classroom. So what I do is I pose students a series of discussion questions that I'm listing here for you in case you were interested in using something like that in your classroom, where I ask students to kind of start with themselves and to reflect upon their own language and their own notions and representations and attitudes toward their own language, which in our classrooms, the dominant language of students is English. So I asked them to kind of reflect on what language that they think that they speak when they say, I speak English. Is it American English? Is it just American? And what about other English speakers in the world? Do they speak exactly the same way as you? And if not, which, they're aware that that's not always the case, how do you then refer to the language that they speak? So it really pushes students to reflect upon some of these aspects that they would consider kind of obvious, but at the end of the day, there's really a lot of complexity there. I ask them about their own accent, what they think an accent is. I typically incorporate those discussions in all my French classes where students are really pushed to examine the notion of accent, a foreign accent in French, an Anglophone accent in their French versus a regional accent in their variety of English. So it really leads to some interesting insights on the part of students. I asked them if they ever feel any sense of embarrassment. So some of the students that come from southern regions of the United States, really resonates with them because I teach here in New York, and they often feel like they have to suppress their accent in order to sort of fit in with their peers and not be identified quite so obviously as speakers of a certain variety. So then, we kind of transition from those notions to how these same notions play out in the context of Québécois French as compared to Français hexagonal or reference French, French that they learn in the classroom. So just some other prompts to kind of explore some notions about how people might feel if you make comments about their accent, even if they're harmless and appear complimentary, such as cute, interesting, beautiful accent, et cetera, et cetera. And I have an excellent reading for this kind of discussion for students. So before they sort of start working on trying to learn the different aspects of Quebecois French. And this reading is in English, and so it can work for really any level. And the particular part of this textbook that I use to prime students for this kind of language variation study is the chapter 1 of this text, French, a Linguistic Introduction. And the subsections that I have here listed just to show you what kind of topics are being addressed. So French is plural, we're talking about les français with the lowercase f as opposed to le français. So it approaches the notion of prescriptivism, so speak this way and not any other way, and the idea of standard French, so the ideology of the standard that we just referred to, and then francophonie and variation and how that plays out. So it's just a 15-page reading that I strongly recommend. And this brings us to how all of this helps us define what is Français Québécois, which is ultimately what I'm trying to do in this part of the talk. So Français Québécois cannot be defined, in other words, without these notions of geographic and situational variation. Sometimes, we'd say regional variation, socio-stylistic variation, social. So we're just going to stick to geographic and situational here. But it subsumes all these different notions. So basically what we're looking at is Français Québécois soutenu, which is a variety that is very close in terms of what we call grammar. Morphosyntax is very close to that of reference French and hexagonal French. There are some lexical differences, which we call québécisme, that reflect the specific North American realities of Quebec French. New words that come from langue autochtone, some of the words that were preserved from earlier stages of French brought by settlers, et cetera, and some differences in pronunciation. And it's really important to note here with students that there are many aspects of Quebec French pronunciation that distinguish it from of reference French that are indeed accepted by most Quebec speakers as part of that Québécois French soutenu, that standard Quebec French. Because students often make this kind of a false assumption that all the stuff that makes Quebec French different and make it accounts for that sort of accent of Quebec French that they perceive. Well, that's because it's colloquial. It's all colloquial variants or ways of pronouncing, and it does not belong in the formal socio linguistic realm, and that is not the case at all. That said, when you go to Français Québécois familier, as we saw in our initial diagram with the arrows kind of growing further apart from one another in the familier, registre familier, now we're seeing a lot more variation. So, of course, the morphosyntactic structure, the grammar is still preserved, but we are seeing some differences, things that are particular to Quebec French, such as pronouns like nous autres, vous autres, or a way of asking a question by adding the particle tu, instead of saying just ça va, or est-ce que ça va, ça va-tu, right? So students really enjoy, in my experience, going kind of through some of these differences and understanding kind of the extent of those differences, and ultimately arriving at the conclusion that these differences, they don't mean that you're no longer speaking French. The Français Québécois is still French. It's just a different variety of French. So I'm just giving very sort of representative examples here of what we can use in our classroom to show students, what some of these differences are in pronunciation and vocabulary, things like les sacres, which students really enjoy learning about, and all the kind of, cultural connections to Catholicism, and how les sacres differ from those used in France and other places in the Francophonie. So this is a model of introducing Quebecois French in the classroom that has really worked quite well for me in my experience. So what are some of the resources for integrating Quebecois French in our courses that we can use right now? So the textbook that I use in my courses, it's really, there's just, let's just say from the get-go, there's not an abundance of materials out there. And there's certainly not materials that are geared to learners, Anglophone learners of French. So this particular resource is geared toward native speakers of French, but I found that with some help and some adaptations and some selecting, our students are able to use the textbook and in the course. But even if it's not something that you're able to use in your course, this could be your resource as an instructor to introduce certain elements of Français Québécois, linguistic or historical, or language planning, for example, in your classroom, in the bits and pieces that you select and control. So I strongly recommend this textbook. I'm listing the different chapters that it consists of, just to give you an idea of what kind of content it presents. And it's very, very affordable, which is something that students really enjoy. And each chapter is accompanied by a set of questions that are really quite factual. I tend to supplement with some more analytical questions, but what's great about these questions is it helps students process the content of the reading and go back and find the information that will help them answer those questions, and thus rehash some of that information, review. There is also a wonderful resource that is maintained by the linguistics department at the Université du Québec à Chicoutimi, or UQAC. And so I think I will have an opportunity to share this PowerPoint with the organizers of the series, and then all of these are hyperlinks, so you would be able to easily locate all of these materials. So instead of going into these resources and demonstrating how it works, so to avoid any kind of technical issues or delays, I just went ahead and took some screenshots just to show you what you would encounter when you get to these resources. And I have a brief list of what they offer. So for this particular website, you have a description of every single phenomenon that characterizes the Quebecois French. And this is something that an instructor can use for their own information to later share with students. And it's something that students can really explore on their own. And what's great about it is every form that is listed as an example has an audio file with the pronunciation in Français Québécois and Français de référence that immediately follows. So it allows students to compare. It also has descriptions of the phenomena, conditionnement linguistique, this happens when. So just a lot of information that students can pick and choose from to really hear and experience Français Québécois in a much more scientific fashion, as opposed to just kind of impressionistically. There's also wordreference.com, which is used by many instructors and many students, really a great dictionary in my opinion. But it actually has a drop-down menu for pronunciation, where you can choose a Canadian. It's labeled Canada, so for better or worse, so it represents really, at the end of the day, the Quebecois variety of French, North American French. So it certainly doesn't have Acadian pronunciations there, but it's I'm including here an example of the word site. So for the France pronunciation option, it would say site. And then the Quebecois pronunciation is markedly different. You can hear it right away, which sounds like more like sit. So that's the research that students are always quite happy to discover and be able to use on their own. Oops. Another wonderful resource that's made available by a group of linguists at the Université de Sherbrooke. So it's a corpus of spoken French. So corpora are used widely in various fields beyond linguistics, but there are these really great sources of authentic language use and are really just really fun to play with. So this is language that has been generated and recorded by specialists, who know how to go about that. And so it's very, very reflective of real authentic language used by these speakers. And this particular corpus is completely devoted to Quebecois French, and it's very searchable. So I'm showing you here an example of the word puis, which is a connector word in Quebecois French, typically means and. So it's derived from puis. And so if you search for puis, it's going to give you all the examples, all the occurrences of that word in a context, in a sentence. And you can also delimit your findings by some sociolinguistic factors, such as age or sex or scolarité. So you could see, how many women above the age of 35 with a bachelor's degree use the word puis in their Quebecois French, and you can design a variety of activities for students to work with this data on their own, to do the research, to make some generalizations and conclusions and comparisons. So of course, all of this is available as free access online. And there's also the Dictionnaire Uito, also a Université de Sherbrooke resource, and it looks like this. I use the example of the word chum. So you not only get definitions and etymology, but also sociolinguistic characteristics, which are great for class discussions. You have here chum that is labeled as anglicisme critiqué. So that kind of leads into this whole notion that some anglicisms are accepted and some not, some are critiqué. You get to talk a little bit about that with students. So also a wonderful resource. Inclusive language, as I said, is something that really is kind of this a very prominent characteristic historically and today of Quebecois French. And it's something that I worked a little bit on in my own research. So this is just a very brief recap of when it all started and where we are today. And of course, this is all under the careful guidance of Office Québécois de la Langue Française, which has been heavily involved in the feminization of professions and titles. And today, we have moved from sort of early feminization to now modern rédaction épicène, which we would like to be much more inclusive than the previous binary distinction of masculine and feminine. And this allows us to challenge the masculine as neutral notion in French. And so I'm giving some examples here of what you will find in Québécois French: professeur, chercheuse, les étudiantes et les étudiants, to refer to a group of students whose gender is unknown. Les Québécois et les Québécoises has become a staple of political discourse in Quebec when politicians address an audience of Quebecers. This is almost a requirement at this point, and it's just very natural, it seems. And then you have something called doublets, where instead of restating one of the two or each of the two forms, masculine and feminine, you're basically going for kind of a abbreviated representation with a periods, point médian, just depending on capitalization. There are different ways of going about it. So what I have here are some resources offered by the Office québécois de la langue française, as I said, and all of these are hyperlinks to documents. With the first one, kind of guide d'auto-formation, so self-teaching guide on rédaction épicène that is very accessible, easy to use, and has a ton of examples of different forms. Principes généraux de la rédaction épicène. This is all kind of in the same general area. And here the screenshot shows you how you can research a term on their website, which will search Banque de dépannage linguistique and Grand Dictionnaire terminologique at the same time, and will give you articles that have a plethora of information on the particular usage of a form that is inclusive. So linguistic landscape, so the signs, all the writing that you see in open public spaces, has become, is becoming an approach, a method in teaching French. So I think this particular approach, a linguistic landscape, gives us a really great opportunity to engage students more concretely with inclusive language use in these various public spaces. So here I'm just giving a reference to an article that I wrote after doing some field work in Quebec on the campus of Université Laval, and then in several Parisian universities, where I compared the use of inclusive language in linguistic landscape. And it's basically thousands of pictures of signs that I took and then created these data sets of forms. And I share these data sets with my students. The pictures themselves, they absolutely love going through the pictures and extracting the forms, analyzing those forms, and trying to see what they can do with them based on the assignment that I'm providing. So it looks something like this, where I would give a photograph of one of the signs, and it will contain a form that is either inclusive or not. So students will then do the analysis and decide whether that's inclusive representation or not inclusive representation. What kind of representation is it? Is it a doublet? Is it the full form? Is it parentheses? Is it point médian, et cetera, et cetera. So these are just some examples of the signs that I would work with. And in the course that I teach that has an on-site component where I take students to Quebec, actually this is an assignment that they do on campus, is they go around with their smartphone and take pictures of various signs and then analyze those signs for inclusivity. For example, on the far right, you have an example of a non-inclusive language use, where un outil pour l'enseignant only has masculine as neutral usage here. So yeah, some more examples. So in here, I'm just providing a little bit of context in terms of the inclusion, making the inclusive more inclusive. So in other words, the inclusion of non-binary speakers and reference into inclusive language use. And one of the prominent issues in that area is distinguishing between le genre neutre and l'inclusif. One doesn't go as far as the other, and as someone who is not a scholar who focuses on this at the moment, I decided to simply use some quotes from a website which is representative of the community of speakers that we have in focus here. So I'm using the words of representatives of that community to kind of give you an idea of what the issue is and the differences between inclusif and neutre. And some examples of how something can be une forme inclusive, non-genrée, versus le neutre, which is specifically used for une personne non-binaire, whereas inclusif, that's more to represent anyone where you don't know necessarily their gender identification. And some interesting forms that are being introduced, these forms are not ratified by the entirety of the francophonie, but the first steps are being made. And it's really wonderful to be able to introduce these forms to students in our classes and to have them kind of evaluate the forms and discuss how these forms compare in terms of representing different groups of people, whether they would want to use these forms as applied to themselves, some of the morphological aspects of the forms. Sometimes you have a form where you hear the ending as being different from, masculin, and sometimes you don't. It's just in writing that you see the difference, and so discussing the merits of those aspects as well. And then I'm giving some images here that really nicely summarize what is out there at the moment in terms of pronom neutre en français. That students are able to follow with some examples, and then le neutre à l'oral, so discusses, as I said before, this issue of how do you pronounce in spoken French these various forms, and for those speakers and reference to feel represented by those forms. And these are all Quebecois guides. They come from Université McGill. So once again, it's a nice way to connect this linguistic innovation to Quebec, Quebecois French, and Quebec content. One of the things that I do as an exercise with students is transforming texts that are not inclusive into texts that are. So this is an example of, or these two are examples of inclusive and non-binary texts. So it could be something that's introduced to students as is, or it could be, it could be rendered non-inclusive and given the students as a non-inclusive text, and then seeing what they can do, for example, in small groups, to transform the text to make it more inclusive with the forms that are out there. So this information can be included in syllabi. I find that students often find it encouraging, and regardless of whether it's something that they want or need to use. But I provide a brief statement with a link to some of the information that I just showed you on the slides, where students can explore some of these options and see which ones of those options they might choose to adopt. So just some examples of activities or projects. I have students work with websites. Such an easy a way of accessing data freely. So a comparative study of university websites between Quebec and another Francophone country in terms of inclusivity. You tell students, locate the website Université Laval and examine several pages for inclusivity. How are students being referred to, professors, staff? So nouns versus adjectives versus pronouns, and have them compile data in a variety of ways. The same thing can be done with job ads, for example. That's something that students can also find online quite easily and compare, for example, France versus Quebec. This past semester, one of my students chose to look at Starbucks job advertisements in Paris versus Montreal, and so they compared use of inclusive language in advertising the vacancies, the positions. So that was really quite interesting, and lots of interesting insights. As I said before, change non-inclusive texts into inclusive texts. I realize this isn't an option probably for everybody, but for those of us who are in some kind of close proximity to a Francophone community somewhere in Canada, in Quebec in particular, I had students who would take a spring break trip to Montreal. I typically teach a course French in North America in the spring, and students go around and taking pictures of signs on which they later base their research project for the course. An example of an exercise I conducted with my students, where I asked them to research all the different organizations as associations that are available at Université Laval in Quebec City. and they pulled up all these different names of organizations and classified them as inclusive or non-inclusive. So some interesting conclusions there, sometimes depending on the field in which the organization is based. It could be more inclusive or less inclusive. So just really a platform for some interesting discussions. And these are just some examples of student projects that I was able to encourage students to do. And a lot of these are their own ideas. So inclusive language use by influencers on Instagram. I tried to make sure that just for the particular aspect of Quebecois French that we stick with Quebec and Canada. So they, utilized their familiarity with social media to see if they can use social media as a resource for data collection, which is something that is, very pervasive in the field of sociolinguistics itself. And then another example of a student project, something that I just referred to, where a student studied feminization tendencies in forms representing different titles and positions in the French-speaking world. And they looked at 4 different French-speaking countries with Canada or Quebec being featured as well, and made some comparisons, and were able to organize their data in all these different ways, and also was very insightful and exciting for them to share this with the class. So just some of the examples of courses that I was able to develop and sustain. It's always a bit of a challenge for obvious reasons, but these courses tend to attract steady enrollments to the extent that that's even possible anymore, especially at the upper level. But I just got back from the first post-pandemic iteration of Understanding Modern Quebec, which is a course I teach for students at various levels. There's just not really another way to do it. But it's offered, at the 300 level, at the 400 level, depending on what the student needs. So it's 2 weeks online where we learn using this really excellent textbook called Je me souviens, written by Liz Blood and Vincent Morissette, and it's Georgetown University Press. I have a reference there on the slide. It's a really great textbook, but it's really much more geared toward an experience like what I was doing, which is having students learn in Quebec. So it has students really engage with their environment as they are discovering these things. They go and see those things, and they can see the monuments and go to the museums that they're learning about in the book. But it still can be used in class, at least selectively. I think it's a really great resource, but it's much more cultural oriented rather than specifically Quebecois French. I always run this program during the month of June, which allows us to access such important cultural milestones as more recently in the Indigenous Peoples Day, La Fête Nationale of Quebec and Canada Day, right before we leave. But what is really great, about Quebec City and a course like this, and again, this doesn't have to be necessarily a course. It could be some short-term opportunity that you might want to create for your students, if that's something that you're able to do and to travel there. Quebec City's museums and various sites are very amenable to, they lend themselves really easily to that kind of learning experience. The guided tours at museums are absolutely excellent in terms of being accessible and interesting to intermediate to advanced learners of French from US schools. So they really cater to that kind of audience, and we've had nothing but absolutely wonderful experiences in Musée de la Civilisation, Musée National des Beaux-Arts, Le Parlement, etc. So I definitely think that Quebec City provides that kind of opportunity for our students, short-term or long-term, to engage with the culture and the language. And then the French in North America is a course in sociolinguistics. It's really quite advanced, but we kind of just travel through North American Francophonie, and we do start with Quebec, and it is most of the weeks of the course are spent in Quebec. The students get really kind of tired of Quebec at a certain point, the way that they, express that to me. But there's just, it's incontournable. It's really difficult to, travel intellectually in the Francophonie of North America without kind of using Quebec as kind of a point of reference for our students. So the really important aspect of the course is for students to engage with authentic language data. And that can come in the form of, collecting information and data on websites, or by taking pictures, or by interviewing native speakers or bilingual speakers. I try and engage anybody that I can find on campus who has some connection as a speaker to Quebec and Quebecois French, and I connect that speaker with students, bring them into the classroom, and really try and make Quebecois French real for those students, and have students interview those speakers as a group to try to access some of those attitudes towards Quebec French that those speakers have themselves, and linguistic insecurity, and how they feel about their variety of French. And then students can kind of compare with their own sentiments about it. So it typically ends up being a very enriching, a fantastic experience for students. So some of the materials that I use, I already showed you the Christian Reinke, Le Français Québécois d'aujourd'hui, I believe. There's also a great resource. It's available as a series of PDF chapters called Manuel de Francophonie. And there is an excellent chapter on Quebec that kind of summarizes all of Français Québécois, from its historical development to use of different forms, to attitudes, to language planning, etc. So that's something that I had our library purchase, and students are able to use that as a resource for the course for free. So finally, some of the additional resources that I think can really enhance or get you started on using Quebecois content in your courses, whether it's Quebecois French, which is my focus, or more cultural extensions. The vitrine linguistique offered by Office Québécois de la langue française, there's just a lot there. And this particular link is specifically to rédaction, communication, féminisation. But they are just a wonderful resource to use for yourself and for your students, as far as, I want to learn how to write an email in French, and they will give you examples and all the different guidelines for how to begin and how to end, and what to do and what not to do. And they're very specific about which of those aspects are particular to Quebec French and which are more generally applicable. So the Trésor de la langue française au Québec is also a site that's definitely worth exploring. There are all kinds of video and audio and textual materials that are available. It would probably take an hour just to explore the entire website, and they absolutely love working with instructors from the United States who look to bring Quebecois French to their students. The person who currently heads up the project is absolutely thrilled that we have an interest on the part of instructors here to introduce Quebecois French to students as a legitimate variety of French, and they enjoy being reached out to and working on some more specific things with the instructors. The more recent initiative that comes from France, Le Dictionnaire des Francophones. So présentation du projet tells you a little bit about what it is, but it's like this multi-source kind of place where all these different dictionaries representing different registers and regions of Francophonie meet, and it's a great way to access a lot of the sociolinguistic information associated with a word as opposed to just its direct definition, where it's spoken, by whom, when, etc. Just a modest mention of my organization, American Council for Quebec Studies. We offer biannual conferences where instructors are able to meet and network, and we're constantly looking to make our conference content that's geared toward teachers more robust. And one way in which we do that are these outreach seminars that we offer every couple of years, where it's basically some intensive learning about how to introduce Quebecois content in various ways in your curriculum. The Quebec government delegations, there are 5 or 6 of them. Hopefully there's one that's close by, but some of them are better than others in terms of working with instructors, providing them with opportunities and financial support. But it's definitely something worth exploring. I've been able to benefit from a variety of grants, a grant for purchasing materials for our library, materials on Quebec. A colleague in my department who does not specialize in Quebec studies, but was able to obtain a grant to develop a course on diasporic literature of Montreal, called it Multicultural Quebec, and her stay in Montreal was sponsored by this grant. So support for development of courses on Quebec, support for initiatives on Quebec, so much more broadly defined. It could be somebody you bring in, something you acquire, something you organize. So there is more money available, I would say, than participants or instructors willing to pursue these options. Just people don't typically know about them. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to go to these websites and apply for these funds. And then my personal favorite for various cultural and linguistic content is the Radio-Canada website. And what's really kind of great about it in terms of connecting it to Quebecois French in the classroom is that this is where you would hear what is known as Français Québécois soutenu. So the language of TV anchors and presenters, especially in the news sector, typically viewed by Quebecers themselves as the Français Québécois soutenu. So I use that as an example of what Quebec French sounds like at that level, level of what we often call standards. So students are able to hear and see that at that level, it's really quite indistinguishable from the French that they know from their classroom experience, particularly at their level of French. So I believe that this completes my presentation. I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to share what I have to offer. And I believe this is now time for questions, if there are any, but I would definitely encourage anyone who's interested in more of anything that you heard today to reach out to me via email at any time. I would be happy to engage with anyone who's interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bosworth. That was a real plethora of resources. I can't actually wait to dig in there. So many that I did not know about at all. So thank you so much for that. Before we wrap up here, I'm just double checking if there's any questions, if anyone wanted to put anything in the Q&A before we finish our final session today. Burning questions. We do have a request for your email if for that promised reach out, but
absolutely.
We can, I was going to say we will, there were so many wonderful resources. Of course, we will send those out in our follow-up thank you email. And may we include your email at that time as well, Dr. Bosworth?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Then we will do that. And anything else before we? Yes, we will receive the recording. If you were a registered person, which of course you are because you're here today, there will be a follow-up email usually within 48 to 72 hours, where there's some captioning needs that have to happen as well, with the mix of French and English and different things we have. So it will come out shortly. It'll come out this week, the follow-up recording. And again, those lists of many links that I'm excited to dive into. So, and I know we're a little past time, and there's a thank you for how the resources look, but there was just so much to talk about today, right? So I really want to thank you. Just double check your questions last time. Great, thank you. Some thank yous. It was very interesting. And I really want to thank you all so much for joining us today. And of course, my thanks again to the Center for Canadian American Studies and the Western Washington University Alumni Association for making this whole series possible. I hope this series has been helpful or opened new avenues of inquiry and thought around French language in your classroom. And I just really, truly want to thank you so much for your time and attention, especially during summer break on Mondays. And best wishes to every classroom teacher out there for the upcoming year. I hope it goes very well. And that some of this that we learn together comes into your classroom this year as well. So please feel free also to reach out to me, Kyla, about any further questions about the series or the recordings, etc. And we really look forward to bringing you some exciting new programs in the fall as well that we're looking forward to. So thank you so very much for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you soon.